The engines roared, but the silence in first class was louder. Two teenage boys stood frozen backpacks in hand as a flight attendant blocked their path. "You don't belong here," she said coldly, holding their tickets like evidence. Passengers looked away, pretending not to see. "We paid for these seats," the older boy managed, his voice trembling with pride and disbelief. "Not anymore," she snapped. Cameras lifted. The humiliation burned. What no one on that plane realized was that these weren't just any passengers, they were the sons of the airline's CEO. And by the time their father stepped in, this flight would never take off the same again. The airport was alive with movement. Travelers rushing between terminals, rolling suitcases gliding across polished floors, and the distant sound of boarding announcements filling the air among the crowd. Elon and his younger brother Zaven made their way toward their gate, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. The two boys had been buzzing with excitement ever since their father surprised them with first-class tickets for their trip. It was a reward for their hard work in school, something they had never expected but were thrilled about. Alon, the older of the two, at 15, carried himself with quiet confidence. He was used to looking after Zaven, who at 13 had a boundless energy that made every moment an adventure. As they reached the boarding area, Elon handed both their tickets to the gate agent. The woman scanned them without a second glance and gave them a polite nod. "You're all set? Enjoy your flight." They stepped into the jet bridge, feeling a thrill as they approached the plane, the cool air. Inside the aircraft was a welcome relief from the crowded terminal. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the first-class cabin. A Zion checked their seat numbers 2A and 2B and guided Zavan toward their seats the moment they settled in. Xavian grinned, already reaching for the in-flight entertainment screen. "This is crazy," Xavian whispered, pressing buttons excitedly. "We've never had seats this big before." Elian smirked, adjusting his armrest. "Yeah, well, we earned it." As passengers continued boarding, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking seat number. Melora Cartwright had been working flights for over 15 years. She prided herself on efficiency, on making sure things ran smoothly. She wasn't the warmest crew member, but she knew how to keep order. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, ensuring everything was in place. Then she saw them, two boys alone, seated comfortably in first class. She stopped walking. Something about the sight made her pause. She stepped closer, arms crossed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Are you two in the right seats?" Elon looked up, caught off guard. "Yes, we have first-class tickets." Melora's eyes flicked over them, skepticism evident on her face. "Where are your parents?" Zavin blinked. "We're traveling alone," he answered, her lips pressed together. "I see Alan reached into his hoodie pocket, pulling out his boarding pass here," he said, handing it over. Zaven did the same. Melora took the tickets, glancing at them, but something in her expression remained doubtful. She held on to them longer than necessary, flipping them over, inspecting them again. Then, without a word, she handed them back. "I'll be right back," she said, before turning and walking toward the front of the cabin. Elon frowned, watching her go. "That was weird," he muttered under his breath. Xaven shifted in his seat. "Why do I feel like she doesn't believe us?" Passengers around them had noticed the interaction. Some exchanged glances, others kept their heads down, pretending not to hear. The first-class cabin, which had felt welcoming just moments ago, suddenly felt different. A few minutes later, Melora returned, this time with another crew member, Bennett, the senior flight attendant. He walked with a sense of authority, but his expression was unreadable. "We need you both to come with us," Melora said. Her voice louder this time. Elon sat up straighter. "Why, what's wrong?" "There's been a mistake with your seating," she said, her patience thinning. "You need to move." Xavin's face fell. "But we have first-class tickets." He repeated, his voice smaller this time. Bennett cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Boys, let's not make this difficult." Elon clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew arguing wouldn't help, so he inhaled deeply and grabbed his backpack. Zavan hesitated before doing the same as they stood. The energy in the cabin shifted. People watched but said nothing. Some passengers avoided looking at them altogether. Others stole glances, but quickly returned to their magazines or phones. Melora LED them down the aisle toward the exit, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. Elon and Zavin walked past the rows of passengers, feeling every stare the moment they stepped off the plane. A member of the ground staff. Lydia was already waiting for them. "Step aside." "Please," Lydia instructed, motioning them toward a nearby seating area. The second they were off the plane, Zavin pulled out his phone and typed a quick message with shaky fingers. "Zavan, they made us leave our seats, said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting. A reply came almost instantly, "Dad." "What flight number?" Airline read the message and exhaled slowly. "Hyun's going to be mad," he muted Zavin. Nodded really mad inside the plane. Melora returned to the first-class cabin, dusting off her hands as if she had just handled a small inconvenience. She glanced at Bennett, giving a short nod. Problem solved. She said she didn't know that the decision she had just made was about to change everything. The airport terminal felt colder than before. Elian and Zavin sat in stiff chairs near the gate, their backpacks resting at their feet. A steady stream of passengers moved through the terminal, some rushing to catch flights, others waiting around, unaware of what had just happened to them. Zavin kept looking at his phone, waiting for another message from their father. Elon, on the other hand, sat quietly, jaw clenched, replaying everything in his head. "She didn't even check properly," Zavin muttered. His fingers drummed anxiously against his leg. "She just looked at us and decided we didn't belong." Elon let out a slow breath, his mind working through the situation. "She didn't even question anyone else in first class," he pointed out. "Just us." Zan's grip on his phone tightened. "Do you think Dad is going to?" Before he could finish, his phone vibrated in his hands. He quickly unlocked it and read the new message. "Dad, stay where you are. I'm handling it." Elon read over Xavier's shoulder. Then leaned back in his seat. "That means she's in trouble." Xavier smirked slightly. "Good, back inside the plane." Melora Cartwright moved through the first-class cabin, checking overhead bins, adjusting small details to her. The situation was already behind her. She had followed her instinct, and as far as she was concerned, that was the end of it. She glanced at the passengers she had spoken to earlier, offering a professional smile. "Apologies for the delay," she said smoothly. "We had to clear up a seating issue, but everything is taken care of." Now a few passengers nodded politely, though some still looked curious. A woman in seat 3D, an older lady dressed in a navy blue blazer, frowned slightly. "Were they not supposed to be here?" she asked. Melora straightened her posture. It was just a misunderstanding. She said quickly the woman didn't seem convinced, but said nothing more at the front of the plane. Captain Audrey Vaugh was reviewing flight details with his co-pilot when the in-flight phone beside him rang. He picked it up, expecting a routine check-in instead. A low, serious voice spoke on the other end. "This is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. We just received a direct call from the CEO's office." Ulrich's grip on the receiver tightened slightly. "Go ahead. Did a flight attendant just remove 2 unaccompanied minors from first class?" Audrey glanced at the cabin door. Suddenly aware of how quiet things had gotten outside, he had been briefed about unaccompanied minors traveling on the flight but hadn't been informed of any seating issues. "I wasn't aware of any removal," Audrey admitted. "Well, it happened." Dorian said, his tone clipped, "and the CEO himself is on his way to the airline's operations center right now." Ulrich's eyes narrowed. "The CEO?" "Yes." Dorian confirmed, "Darius Langford and those 2 boys. They're his sons." A brief, heavy silence followed. Audrey leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. "Who is responsible for this?" Audrey asked. "The report says a senior flight attendant, Melora Cartwright." Audrey nodded. He had worked with her before, efficient, experienced, unbending. "Put me through to her." He said. Dorian didn't hesitate already. "Done. You'll want to handle this quickly." Audrey set down the receiver and pressed the button for the in-flight announcement system. His voice came over the speakers, steady but firm. "Miss Cartwright, report to the cockpit immediately." Immediately, Melora paused mid-step. A few passengers looked up at the announcement for the first time all morning. She felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of doubt. She turned on her heel and made her way toward the front of the plane, straightening her uniform as she walked. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that door, but she was about to find out. Melora stepped into the cockpit, the door shutting behind her with a quiet click. Captain Aldry Vaugh sat in his chair, his posture straighter than usual, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick. He didn't greet her like he normally would. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "Miss Cartwright," he began, his tone sharp but controlled. "I need an explanation." Melora kept her back straight, her years of experience making it easy to mask the unease creeping into her chest. "Sir, there was a seating issue in first class," she said evenly. "Two unaccompanied minors were in premium seats given the circumstances. I made the call to remove them and reassign their seating." Aldrich's eyes didn't leave hers. "And what circumstances were those?" Melora hesitated just for a second, but she covered it quickly. "They were alone," she answered. "It seemed out of place. I wasn't informed of any minors traveling in first class, and I had to act quickly." Aldry let out a slow breath. "Did you check the manifest?" Her stomach twisted. Yes or no, Miss Cartwright?" Her lips parted slightly, but no answer came. Aldrich's jaw tightened. "Did you verify their tickets with the gate agent?" Another pause. Melora suddenly felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. "I looked at the tickets," she said, her voice quieter now. "But Aldry shook his head. "You didn't verify. You assumed." Melora's throat went dry. Aldry didn't raise his voice, but his words carried weight. "The two passengers you removed from first class were Kenzo Elan Langford and Xavier Darius Langford. Do you know who their father is?" Her pulse quickened. "Darius Langford, the CEO of this airline." A cold chill ran down Melora's spine. Aldry continued, his voice like steel. "Right now, Darius Langford is personally reviewing this situation. You have single-handedly created an incident that will not only affect this flight, but could result in severe consequences for the airline." Melora swallowed hard, but the dryness in her throat made it difficult. Aldrich's next words came slowly, deliberately. "You will return to the boys, personally apologize, and escort them back to their original seats in first class." Immediately, she opened her mouth, ready to argue, to say she had only been doing her job. But the look in Aldrich's eyes told her this wasn't up for debate. "Do I make myself clear?" Melora clenched her fists at her sides, but forced a nod. "Yes, Captain, then fix your mistake," he said, turning away from her. She felt the heat in her face as she turned on her heel, stepping out of the cockpit the moment the door shut behind her. She let out a slow breath, her hands slightly trembling. Passengers continued settling in, oblivious to what had just happened behind the cockpit door. But Melora felt it. The shift for the first time in her career, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she had no idea what was waiting for her when the plane landed. Melora walked stiffly down the aisle, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. She had handled difficult passengers, strict supervisors, and high-pressure situations before. But nothing compared to this. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the shift in energy. Some passengers had heard the announcement from the captain. Others had noticed the way she had walked two young boys off the plane just minutes ago, and now they were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Zavan sat with his arms crossed, staring down at his phone, while Aeon sat upright, his expression unreadable. They hadn't spoken much since their father's message, but they knew something was happening. Melora stopped in front of them, forcing a tight smile. She crouched slightly to meet their eye level, her voice quieter than before. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone measured but strained. "I'd like to escort you both back to your original seats in first class." Savian looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Now you want us to come back?" Elon studied her closely. What changed? Melora's jaw tightened. It was an error in seating, she said quickly, avoiding eye contact. I apologize for the inconvenience. Xavier blinked, tilting his head. A mistake, he repeated. But you saw our tickets. Airline didn't let her off easily. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, he pointed out. Just us. The cabin was quiet now. Passengers were listening. Some had shifted slightly in their seats, glancing at one another, pretending not to be interested while hanging on to every word. Melora pressed her lips together. She had been in control for years, never second-guessed, never questioned, but now she was standing in front of two boys who weren't letting her escape the weight of her decision. I may have misjudged the situation, she admitted, forcing herself to stay composed. But I'd like to correct it now. Elon exchanged a glance with Xavier before looking back at her. You didn't just misjudge, he said evenly. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Melora swallowed. The heat in her face returned. She wanted to end this conversation quickly, to move past it, to act like it never happened. But the moment was stretching longer than she had anticipated. Passengers were no longer pretending to ignore them. A woman in seat 3D shifted uncomfortably her eyes. Darting between Melora and the boys, a man in seat 4A adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. The uncomfortable truth had settled over the cabin. Everyone had seen what happened, and no one had spoken up. Xavier leaned back slightly. Crossing his arms, Dad told us to take our time, he said casually, looking at Elon. So maybe we shouldn't be in a hurry. Elon smirked slightly. Yeah, he agreed. Maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first. Melora clenched her jaw, forcing her voice to stay level. I understand if you're upset, she said, choosing her words carefully, but I need you both to return to your seats now. Xavier held up his phone. Maybe I should ask Dad first. That made her stomach tighten. Passengers murmured now. Whispers carrying across the row. They knew. Melora exhaled sharply and took a small step back. Of course, she said stiffly. I'll give you a moment. She turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her hands cold and clammy. She had never felt like this before, completely powerless. Meanwhile, Alien leaned toward Xavier. Send him a message, he said quietly. Xavier nodded, typing quickly. Xavier, she wants us to come back. What do we do? Seconds later, their father's response came. Dad makes sure she understands what she did. A lion smirked, sliding his phone into his pocket. Guess we not in a hurry after all, and just like that, the power had shifted. Melora stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow. She could still feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their whispers carrying through the cabin like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, the one who kept things running the way they should. But now, for the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control across the cabin. Elon and Xavier remained seated in the economy section, making no effort to rush back. Elon leaned back against his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, while Xavier scrolled through his phone with a smug expression. Neither of them was in a hurry. Xavier glanced at his screen and chuckled. He's still texting. Elon smirked slightly. What did he say? Xavier read the message out loud. Dad, she made a decision. Now she needs to live with it. Don't move until she actually apologizes. Elon raised an eyebrow. Not just an apology. An actual apology? Savan grinned. I like his style. Meanwhile, in the galley, Lima, a younger flight attendant who had been observing the entire situation, hesitated before stepping closer to Melora. Are you okay? She asked cautiously. Melora shot her a sharp glance. I don't need your concern, Helma. Helma held up her hands in surrender. I was just asking. She leaned against the counter, watching Melora closely. You know this isn't going away, right? Melora turned away, pretending to be busy organizing a tray. It was a misunderstanding, she muttered. Helma scoffed. Misunderstanding? You didn't question a single other person in first class. Just them. Melora's grip on the tray tightened. Let me guess, Halima continued. You thought they didn't belong. You assumed something. Melora didn't respond. Halma sighed, shaking her head. I've worked under you long enough to know you don't like being wrong, but this is a whole different level of bad. Melora set the tray down with a little too much force. I already spoke to them, and how did that go? Helma asked. Folding her arms, Melora shot her a glare before turning toward the aisle. I'll handle it. Helma watched her go, muttering under her breath. Not the way you think you will. Melora straightened her uniform and walked back down the aisle toward Elon and Zaven. The boys looked up as she approached, but neither of them moved. She cleared her throat. Are you ready to return to your seats? Ian leaned back, his arms resting comfortably on the armrests. Are you ready to actually apologize? Melora stiffened. I already said it was a misunderstanding. Zaven raised an eyebrow. That's not an apology. Melora exhaled sharply, glancing around at the watching passengers. She hated this, she hated. Feeling like she had lost control of the situation, but she could see it clearly. Now their father's message had given them the upper hand, and they weren't going to budge until she did this the right way for Ing herself to keep her voice even. She met their gaze. I shouldn't have assumed you weren't supposed to be in first class. She admitted, I was wrong. I apologize. Xavier tilted his head for what exactly? Melora clenched her jaw for questioning your tickets for making you leave your seats. Elon nodded, finally pushing himself up from his chair. That's better. Xavier stood as well, adjusting his backpack. Took you long enough. The flight was silent as they walked back through the aisle, every pair of eyes following them. This time, the passengers didn't ignore them. They saw everything as they reached their first-class seats. Airline settled in, adjusting the seatbelt. Zaven leaned toward him, whispering, Dad's going to love this update. Melora turned to leave, but Ellen's voice stopped her. Oh, and Miss Cartwright? She turned, her expression stiff. Ellen's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. If you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught. Melora held his gaze for a second longer before turning away, her face burning for the first time in her career. She wasn't the one giving orders, and she hated it. Melora walked briskly back toward the galley, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew the moment she turned around. The whispers would start again. The passengers had seen everything they had witnessed. Her make a snap decision, humiliate two boys, and then be forced to backtrack when she realized who they were. She reached the galley and leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply. Hell Lima was still there, watching with an amused expression. So how'd that go? Melora shot her a sharp look. Not now. Helma smirked. I'll take that as a terribly. Melora ignored her and grabbed a stack of cups, pretending to busy herself, but her hands were trembling. Hell Lima leaned against the counter, folding her arms. You still don't get it, do you? Melora exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. I handled the situation. Helma raised an eyebrow. You think this is handled? She scoffed. You pulled two kids out of first class based on nothing but your own assumptions. Then you made them walk back through the cabin like they had done something wrong. And now you think an apology is enough to erase that. Melora pressed her lips together, not answering. How Lima didn't let up the fact that they had to demand an apology tells you everything you need to know. Melora turned her back on her, pretending to organize napkins. I don't need a lecture. Helma let out a dry laugh. Oh, you're going to get one, whether you like it or not. She tilted her head toward the first-class section. Because you know who else isn't going to let this slide? Miora didn't have to ask. She already knew Darius Langford. She could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks. A mistake like this on any other flight might have been brushed aside, dismissed with a simple report and a warning. But this mistake involved the CEO's sons, and the entire company was about to find out about it. Meanwhile, back in first class, Z pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. Ilon glanced at him and smirked, updating him. Xavier nodded. Of course, Zaven, she finally apologized, took her long enough. A few seconds later, their father's reply came through. Dad, good. Sit back and relax. I'm handling the rest. Alan raised an eyebrow as he read the message over Zaven's shoulder. That doesn't sound good for her. Zaven grinned. Nope. Not at all. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed. Melora froze. The other flight attendants turned toward her, their expressions wary. Helma gave a slow nod. That'll be him. Melora's stomach twisted as she reached for the phone. Her hand was unsteady as she lifted the receiver to her ear. A deep, calm voice came through the line. This is Darius Langford. Melora's breath caught in her throat. You and I need to talk. Melora swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. The hum of the aircraft felt distant now, drowned out by the weight of the voice on the other end. Darius Langford didn't sound angry. He didn't need to. His tone was calm, measured, the kind of calm that carried more danger than yelling ever could. Mr. Langford. She started forcing her voice to remain steady. You removed my sons from first class without checking their tickets properly. Darius interrupted smoothly. You didn't verify anything you assumed. Melora felt her throat tighten. Sir, I understand that you don't. He cut in. If you did, this conversation wouldn't be happening. A heavy silence stretched between them. Melora's fingers clenched around the phone cord. She had faced difficult passengers before, straight supervisors, even demanding executives. But this was different. This wasn't someone looking for an excuse or a scripted response. This was the man who owned the airline, demanding accountability. I've already apologized to them, she said, trying to regain some control. I escorted them back to first class. Darius let out a slow, unimpressed breath, and Melora blinked. You think that enough? Darius asked, his voice unreadable. You think a forced apology fixes what you did? Melora felt the pressure building in her chest. It was a mistake. She said, voice quieter now, a misjudgment, no. Darius corrected. It was a choice. Melora flinched slightly. You didn't ask anyone else to prove they belonged in first class? Darius continued. Just them. You didn't check the manifest. You didn't call the gate agent. You didn't even stop to consider that you were the one who made a mistake. Melora remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would make it sound better. My sons don't need your approval to sit in first class. Darius said, his voice lower. Now they had their tickets, they followed the rules, the one who didn't. Melora felt her breath turn shallow. She never felt this way. She had been in the industry for 15 years. She knew every policy, every regulation, and yet here she was exposed. Do you understand what happens next? Darius asked. Melora's mouth felt dry. Mr. Langford, I assure you, you're going to file a full incident report the moment this flight lands, he said, his voice sharp. Not an excuse, not a scripted apology, a report. I want to see exactly what went through your head when you decided my sons didn't belong in those seats. Melora's heart pounded. Sir, and then Darius continued, his voice dropping to a cold finality. You're going to explain yourself in front of the executive board. The blood drained from her face, the same board that determines whether or not you keep your job. Darius added. Melora's stomach plummeted. I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think very carefully about how you're going to justify what you did. Darius said, and then clicked. The call ended. Melora stood there. Frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear, the low hum of the disconnected line rang in her ears, but she couldn't move. Hal Lima, who had been watching the entire time, raised an eyebrow. So how'd that go? Melora slowly placed the phone back onto the hook. Her hands clammy without a word, she turned and walked straight to the nearest restroom, locking the door behind her. She gripped the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale. For the first time, the reality of what she had done truly sank in. She had humiliated the sons of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and now she had to answer for it. Melora splashed cold water on her face, gripping the edges of the small sink inside the lavatory. Her reflection stared back at her. But for the first time, she didn't recognize the confident, in-control flight attendant she had always been. She had made a mistake, a serious one, and now the weight of it was pressing down on her like never before. She had thought an apology would be enough to smooth things over, that a quiet return to first class would end the matter. But it hadn't. Darius Langford wasn't letting this go. And deep down, she knew why. This wasn't just about his sons. This was about every passenger she had judged unfairly over the years. Every moment when she had let her assumptions dictate her decisions. The only difference this time, she had picked the wrong people to treat. Unfairly, a sharp knock on the door made her flinch. Melora. It was Bennett, the senior flight attendant. "We need you back out here." She swallowed, steadying her breath before unlocking the door. When she stepped out, Bennett's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before we just got word from ground control. He said in a low voice, leading her away from the other flight attendants, "Security is waiting at the gate when we land." Melora's stomach twisted violently. "Security?" She echoed her voice barely above a whisper. Bennett nodded. "Not for an emergency, but for an escort." He hesitated before adding, "For you." She stared at him. Bennett glanced around, lowering his voice. Even more, Langford made a personal request. Melora's breath hitched. A personal request. That meant this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was serious. "How bad is this?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay level. Bennett exhaled. "They're calling a review hearing immediately after we land. That doesn't happen unless the company is considering serious action." Melora felt her throat close up. She had been with the airline for 15 years. She had given everything to this job, and now it could all be gone because of one moment. One assumption she hadn't thought twice about until it was too late. She turned her gaze toward the first-class cabin. Airline and Xavier were completely at ease, lounging in their seats, scrolling through their phones. They weren't gloating. They weren't even looking in her direction, but they didn't have to. They had already won. Hal Lima stepped closer, her arms crossed as she studied Melora's face, starting to sink in. "Now, isn't it, Melora?" Clenched her jaw. "I'll handle it," Halma scoffed. "Handle it?" She shook her head. "You still don't get it. This isn't about handling it. This is about what happens when someone with real power decides to hold you accountable." Melora's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, but here she was, completely trapped in the consequences of her own actions. The worst part, she had done this to herself. Bennett glanced at his watch. "We land in 30 minutes. You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say." Melora nodded stiffly, but her mind was already racing for the first time in her career. She wasn't sure there was anything she could say to fix this. The final 30 minutes of the flight felt like the longest of Melora's career. Every second dragged her mind, running through possible explanations, excuses, or ways to soften the damage. But the reality was suffocating. There was no way out of this. She stood near the galley, gripping the counter, staring blankly at the service card in front of her. Hal Lima Bennett and the rest of the crew knew what was coming. No one said it out loud, but she could feel it in their stolen glances, in the way they moved around her like she was already gone over the intercom. Captain Aldrich's voice came through calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly." Melora inhaled sharply. 20 minutes. She glanced toward first class. Elian and Zaven sat comfortably, their expressions unreadable. They hadn't spoken to her since she brought them back to their seats, but she could feel them watching, not out of spite, not out of anger, but with the quiet confidence of knowing they had already won. Zavon leaned toward his brother. Whispering something before unlocking his phone, Melora's stomach dropped when she saw him type another message. She knew who he was texting, Darius Langford, and she had no doubt that whatever he was telling their father would only make things worse for her. A few rows back, a businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie. Uncomfortably, he had been one of the many passengers who had watched everything unfold, old earlier, but had chosen to say nothing now. As Melora passed him, he finally spoke. "I hope you learned something from this." he muttered, not even looking at her. Melora stiffened from across the aisle. The woman in seat 3D, the one who had questioned her earlier, shook her head. "The world is changing," she said quietly. "You should have changed with it." Melora felt heat rush to her face. It wasn't just about Darius Langford anymore. Everyone on this flight knew what she had done. They weren't just waiting to see what happened to her when they landed. They were expecting it. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on. Melora moved stiffly back to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Halma stood beside her, arms crossed. "Still think you can handle it?" Melora didn't answer because, for the first time in her career, she didn't know if she could. The plane dipped lower as it prepared for landing. The soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seat belts, some stretching, others peering out the windows to catch a glimpse of the approaching runway. For most of them, this was just another flight ending. But for Melora, it was the beginning of the end. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her fingers ached. Every second that passed was another step closer to whatever punishment awaited her. She could already picture it, walking off the plane, security waiting. The hushed whispers of airline staff as she was pulled aside. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she be given a chance to explain herself? There was nothing to explain. The reality of what she had done had finally settled into her bones. She had made a decision not out of policy, not out of procedure, but out of assumption, and now she was about to pay for it in front of everyone from first class. Elon adjusted his seat bell while keeping his phone in his lap, waiting for the final message from his father. Zavan, on the other hand, was enjoying himself. He smirked slightly as he scrolled through his phone already, imagining the scene that was about to unfold when they landed. "Think he's waiting for us?" Zavan asked, nudging his brother Leon. Nodded definitely. "And I don't think he's alone." Zavan's grin widened. "Oof, she's about to have the worst day of her life from the galley." Miora overheard them. Her stomach twisted. Helma noticed the way Melora's face paled, the way her body tensed at the sound of Zavan's voice. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You're scared." Melora's eyes snapped to her. "I am not hell." Lima raised an eyebrow, really. She gestured toward first class because those two, they're not worried about a thing. They're sitting back, relaxing, knowing that their dad is about to handle this in a way you never saw coming. Melora's pulse quickened. "I've been in difficult situations." Before Hal, Lima tilted her head slightly. "And how many of those situations involved the man who owns the airline demanding an explanation for why you publicly humiliated his kids?" Melora had no response. The cabin grew eerily silent as the plane made its final approach. Passengers straightened in their seats, gripping armrests as the aircraft hovered just above the runway. Then a smooth landing. The wheels touched down with a gentle bounce, the engines roaring as the plane slowed, the overhead lights flickered slightly, and a few passengers let out relieved sighs for most people on board. The flight was over for Melora. It was just beginning. The intercom crackled again. Captain Aldrich's voice came through steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off on behalf of the crew. Thank you for flying with us today." As soon as the announcement ended, Melora saw it through the small opening in the galley curtain. She could see the jet bridge moving into place, and standing just outside the window, a group of men in dark suits. Her breath caught in her throat. They weren't airport security. They weren't random executives. They were personal staff from the CEO's office. Darius Langford's men, waiting passengers in first-class notice, too. The murmur started instantly. Airline glanced out the window and smirked. Xavier let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, yeah," Xavier whispered. "She's done the fastened seatbelt sign, dinged off the plane, doors would open soon." And when they did, Melora had nowhere to hide. Bennett walked up beside her, his face blank, his voice unreadable. "They're waiting for you." Melora's pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to breathe. She had always thought she had power. She had always thought she was the one in charge, but she had never been more wrong the moment the seat bell sign turned off a hush, fell over the plane. Normally, this was the part where passengers rushed to stand, grabbing bags from the overhead bins, eager to leave. But this time, no one moved right away. Everyone felt something was about to happen. Melora's hands were ice cold. She gripped the cart in the galley, steadying herself, forcing herself to think, what could she say? What defense could she possibly give when the man waiting for her owned the very company she worked for through the small window of the cabin door? She could see them standing just outside the jet bridge. 3 men in dark suits, arms crossed, earpieces in their ears. They weren't normal airline staff. They were Langford's people, and they were here for her passengers. Finally started standing, pulling bags down, stretching their legs, but even as they moved, their eyes kept darting toward the front of the plane. The tension was suffocating. Elian took his time unbuckling his seatbelt. He wasn't in a rush. Zavon, on the other hand, was already standing, casually rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a show. "I can't wait to see her face," Zavon muttered to his brother Elon. Smirked. She already knows from the galley. Melora heard them, and for the first time since this ordeal started, she felt something she hadn't before. Panic Bennett appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "You need to go out there." Melora didn't move. Bennett exhaled sharply, look avoiding. "It is going to change anything. You made a bad call now. You have to face it." She clenched her jaw. "I was doing my job." Bennett gave her a long, exhausted look. "Were you?" Melora's throat tightened. The cabin doors unlocked. A quiet hiss filled the air as the door cracked open and the jet bridge fully connected. A uniformed security officer stepped in first. Then right behind him came a man in a charcoal suit, calm and composed, his presence dominating the small entryway. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Melora already knew who he was. Dorian Vance Langford's right-hand man, the head of airline operations, the man who handled internal problems before they turned into public scandals. He was here for her. Dorian stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Melora. The second, their eyes met. Her stomach dropped. Passengers stared, flight attendants held still. Dorian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "M. Cartwright," he said smoothly, his tone polite yet firm. "You need to come with us." Melora's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She felt every single eye in that cabin on her hell. Lima was watching, arms folded, expression unreadable. Bennett shifted uncomfortably beside her, but he didn't speak, and then there were the passengers. Some of them tried to pretend they weren't listening, keeping their heads down, scrolling on their phones, but others, they watched the woman in seat 3D. The one who had questioned Melora's actions earlier pressed her lips together. The businessman in seat 4A, the one who had muttered at her before landing, shook his head slightly, his disappointment evident. They all knew what this was. Melora had been judged, and now she was about to be sentenced for a brief, desperate moment. She considered making a scene, arguing, defending herself, saying that she was just following procedure, that this was all a misunderstanding, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Dorian wasn't here for excuses. Without another word, Melora stepped forward the moment she did. Whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. This was it. She was being escorted off the plane. Passengers moved aside as she walked down the aisle. Some refused to meet her eyes. Others watched intently, murmuring among themselves. Elon sat calmly watching her pass without a word. Zavon, on the other hand, smirked slightly, not out of cruelty, but because justice had been served. As Melora reached the front of the plane, she hesitated. She turned slightly, glancing back at first class at the seats where the 2 boys sat, the seats that had been theirs along. She had been so sure they didn't belong. And now she was the one being forced to leave. Dorian motioned toward the jet bridge. "After you," with one final breath, Melora stepped off the plane, And just like that, she was gone. The moment Melora stepped off the plane, the cabin erupted into whispers. It was as if an unspoken tension had suddenly broken a shift in energy that every passenger felt. Some exchanged glances, others murmured in hushed voices, piecing together what they had just witnessed. She had been removed, escorted off her own flight. Hal Lima, still standing near the galley, let out a slow breath and shook her head. "Wow," she muttered under her breath. Bennett ran a hand down his face, exhaling. That was brutal. In first class, Elian adjusted his watch, calm as ever. Zaven, however, was grinning. That Xavian whispered, leaning toward his brother, was worth every second. Alon smirked. "She didn't see it coming. She thought she had power," Zavon said, shaking his head. But she didn't. Elian tapped his fingers against the armrest. "Dad's not done yet." Zaven raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll fire her?" Elian thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I think he'll make sure she never forgets this flight." Meanwhile, outside the plane, Melora walked down the jet bridge, her heart pounding. She could feel Dorian Vance behind her, his presence heavy. His steps measured. He wasn't rushing her. He didn't need to. She had nowhere to go at the end of the jet bridge. Two more men in suits stood waiting. One held a tablet, the other a folder. Melora's breath felt tight in her chest. This was happening as soon as she reached the open terminal. Dorian stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry, but the authority in his expression was undeniable. "Miss Cartwright," he said smoothly, "you will come with us to the executive office." Melora forced herself to breathe. "Am I?" She swallowed, rephrasing, "Will I be given a chance to explain my side?" Dorian didn't blink. "You'll be given a chance to submit a formal statement, but I'd choose your words carefully." Melora clenched her fists. "I've worked for this airline for 15 years." Dorian's expression didn't change. "And in a single flight, you damaged the company's reputation, alienated premium passengers, and made a decision that has now reached the highest level of corporate review." He tilted his head. "That's impressive in a way." Melora felt her stomach drop. She had expected consequences, maybe a suspension, maybe a quiet rep. Rand, but this she hadn't expected to become a public example. Dorian turned, slightly motioning toward the corridor. "Leighton, go." Melora hesitated for a fraction of a second, but she knew she had no choice. Her career, her future depended on what happened next. She walked forward. Dorian and the two suited men flanked her. They didn't touch her. They didn't push her. But the message was clear. She wasn't in control anymore. Back on the plane, the passengers were still talking about what had happened when the announcement came over the speakers. "This is your captain speaking. We have now reached the gate. The crew will begin deaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." Savan stretched his arms. "Guess it's time to go." Elon nodded, standing up and grabbing his backpack. He glanced at the remaining flight attendants. None of them dared meet his eyes as they walked toward the exit. A few passengers stepped aside, giving them space. Some even offered small nods of respect. It wasn't just about what had happened with Melora. It was about what it represented. The silent, unspoken rule of the world was that people like them had to prove they belonged, that no matter how hard they worked, how much they earned, someone would always question whether they deserved to be there. Not today. Someone else had been forced to answer for their actions, and everyone saw it as they stepped off the plane. A familiar figure stood waiting for them at the terminal entrance, tall, commanding, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit. Darius Langford, their father. Xaven grinned. "Showtime." Elon smirked. "Let's see how this plays out." They walked forward, and the moment their father's eyes met theirs, they knew this wasn't over yet. Darius Langford stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as his sons approached his presence. Alone was enough to command attention, sharp suit, precise posture, a quiet intensity that never needed to be loud to be heard behind him. Several corporate executives and senior airline staff stood waiting, their faces tight with unease. They knew exactly why they were here. Elon and Zaven walked forward, their steps unhurried, carrying the same calmness their father did. They weren't nervous. They didn't have to be the second they reached him. Darius took a long, measured look at both of them. "You good?" he asked, simply. Elon nodded. "Yeah," Zaven smirked, more than good. Darius held their gazes for another moment before turning his attention to the group of airline executives standing behind him. One of them, a nervous-looking man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Mr. Langford, we sincerely apologize for." Darius held up a hand. The man immediately shut. His mouth, a slow, heavy silence settled over the terminal. People were watching now, not just airline staff, but passengers passing through. They stole glances from behind their phones, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day the CEO of the airline personally showed up to handle a situation. Darius let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "Where is she?" The suited men exchanged uneasy glances. "She's on her way to the executive office," one of them answered carefully. Darius nodded once good. He shifted his gaze toward his sons again, as if studying them for any signs of frustration or anger. But Elon and Zaven stood with the same calm, measured confidence he had taught them. Darius exhaled sharply, then spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone around him to hear. "I want to make something very clear." He said, "Not just to my staff, but to every person in this airport right now." The tension thickened instantly. "This isn't about two boys getting removed from their seats," he continued. "This is about the fact that no matter how much success, education, or wealth you have, there will always be someone who looks at you and decides you don't belong here." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, but they didn't interrupt. Darius glanced toward his sons today, that someone was one of my employees, and today that someone learned that accountability applies to everyone. Xavier grinned. Elon smirked. They weren't just watching justice unfold, they were a part of it. Darius turned back to the executives. "I expect a full investigation into not just this incident, but the overall training of all crew members. I want to report on my desk by morning." His voice dropped slightly, dangerously controlled. "And if I find out that this wasn't an isolated issue, then the next person losing their job won't be a flight attendant. It'll be someone sitting in an office." No one spoke. They all knew better. Darius finally turned toward his sons again. Let go with that. He walked past the executives, his sons following. Effortlessly at his side, they didn't need to hear any more. They had already won. Meanwhile, in the executive office, Melora sat in a cold, modern conference room. Her hands folded in her lap across from her, a long glass table stretched toward the far end of the room, where two senior airline officials sat flipping through a thick folder. Her folder, she could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent calculation behind their eyes. She wasn't just any flight attendant anymore, she was a liability. The man sitting closest to her, a serious-looking executive named Nathaniel Clark, finally looked up. His gaze was sharp, unreadable. "You've been with the airline for 15 years. He stated not a single major complaint on your record." Melora nodded stiffly. "That's correct." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, "And yet today you made a call that resulted in you being removed from your own flight by corporate security. Melor, or swallowed hard. It was a mistake." Nathaniel didn't blink a mistake. Melora kept her back. "Straight. I misjudged the situation." Nathaniel exchanged a brief glance with the woman sitting beside him. Another executive, Amar Wells. She tapped a neatly manicured nail against the table. "We have to ask." "Amara," said her voice smooth but firm. "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" Melora hesitated. The silence stretched too long. A mark expression didn't change. That was a yes or no question. Melora's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "No." Nathaniel let out a small sigh, tapping the folder in front of him. "You didn't verify the manifest. You didn't check with the gate agent. You assumed that two unaccompanied young black boys in first class didn't belong there." He shut the folder. "That's not a mistake." "Miss Cartwright, that's a decision." Melora's mouth felt dry. I didn't mean you did mean it." Amara cut in because you never questioned anyone else. You didn't pause. You didn't think twice you saw them and decided Melora's breathing was uneven. Now Nathaniel leaned forward. You were one of the most senior flight attendants on that flight. That means you set the example. And today, the example you set was that rules only apply to some people. Melora felt sick for years. She had enforced rules, policies, and procedures without hesitation. But now she was the one sitting in front of people who had already decided her fate. Nathaniel exhaled. We're still reviewing how this will be handled, but I can tell you this much. Your future with this airline is uncertain. Melora felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Amara glanced toward the security officer standing by the door escort. Miss Cartwright off the premises for now. Melora's throat tightened. Not suspended, not written up, escorted. She was being removed from the building. Melora stood slowly, her legs shaky. The security officer opened the door for her, waiting. The moment she stepped out. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the woman who had aided the CEO's sons, and now she was the one who didn't belong. The cold air outside the corporate office felt different as Melora stepped out. Her body stiff, her movements robotic. The weight of the last few hours settled over her like a crushing blanket. She had lost control of everything. The security officer, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, didn't touch her. Didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. He didn't have to escort her physically. The humiliation had already done its job. She stepped onto the sidewalk, blinking as the bright afternoon sun hit her face. The sounds of the city moved around her, cars honking, people walking past, their lives continuing as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just watched her entire career crumble into dust. Her phone vibrated in her pocket for a split second. She considered ignoring it, but then curiosity won. She pulled it out, her heart plummeting when she saw the notification: breaking news. Airline executive Darius Langford addresses first-class incident involving sons. Melora's stomach twisted. As she tapped the article, the first image she saw was of Darius Langford standing in the airport terminal. His sons on either side of him. The headline underneath it made her skin go cold. No one should have to prove they belong where they already are. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled the article, detailed the entire incident written in a calm yet damning tone. It described how 2 young black passengers were removed from their first-class seats without proper verification, how the flight attendant responsible had been escorted off the plane, how the CEO of the airline had personally stepped in to ensure the situation was handled at the highest level. Then at the very bottom was a statement from Darius Langford himself. My sons did not need to prove their right to sit in first class. Their presence was enough, but someone on my airline, a place where fairness and professionalism should be absolute, chose to believe. Otherwise, this is not just about 2 passengers. It is about a culture that has allowed moments like this to happen over and over again unchecked that changes today. Melora felt her stomach churn. Her name wasn't in the article, but it didn't have to be. Everyone who had been on that FL knew exactly who it was, and now the entire world knew what she had done. She looked up from her phone, her breath uneven. A few feet away, near the entrance of the corporate building, a group of airline employees were standing in a circle, their heads bent over their phones. She didn't have to guess what they were reading. One of them looked up, her eyes meeting Melora for a fraction of a second. Then, without a word, she turned away. Melora's chest tightened painfully. She had always prided herself on being respected, on having authority, on being someone people listened to. But now she wasn't a leader. She wasn't a senior flight attendant. She was a headline, a cautionary tale, a name people would whisper about in break rooms. Her phone vibrated again. Another news update Melora didn't check. It instead, for the first time in years, she felt something she had rarely ever experienced. She felt small. She turned and walked away from the corporate office, her steps slower than they had ever been, and for the first time in 15 years, she had no idea where she was going next. Back at the Langford estate, the ride home was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Lion and Zavan sat across from their father in the back of the sleek black car, the leather seats cool beneath them. Their father hadn't spoken much since they left the airport, but he didn't have to. Elon checked his phone, scrolling through the news. They're all talking about it. Zaven grinned, kicking his feet up slightly. Good. Darius didn't react immediately. He simply rested his elbow on the car door, looking out the tinted window. After a long moment, he finally spoke. Are you satisfied? Zaven shrugged. I mean, yeah. She got what she deserved. Darius finally looked at them, and what exactly did she deserve? Airline raised an eyebrow. She humiliated us. She didn't even think twice before kicking us off that plane. If you hadn't stepped in, she would have gotten away with it. Darius studied them carefully. That's not what I asked. The car fell silent. Zaven shifted slightly in his seat. She needed to learn. Darius nodded slowly, and now she has. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, but understand something. Both boys sat up straighter. Darius's voice was steady. Deliberate power isn't just about what you can take from someone. It's about what you choose to do with it. Zaven frowned slightly. What do you mean? Darius sighed, rolling his shoulders slightly. That woman lost everything today. Not because you made it happen, but because she made a choice and now she's dealing with the consequences. But there's something you both need to remember. Elon leaned forward. What's that? Darius met their eyes, his gaze unwavering. You don't need revenge when the truth speaks for itself. Another silence settled over them. Zaven exhaled, sinking into his seat. So what happens? Now Darius checked his watch. Now we move forward. He glanced out the window again, watching as the city lights flickered past. I already told you, he murmured. No one should ever have to prove they belong where they already are. Zaven smirked. You should put that on a t-shirt. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. Not necessary. Elon smiled slightly. Why not? Darius closed his eyes briefly before answering, because after today he opened his eyes again, his expression unreadable. No one is ever going to forget it. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the city skyline as Darius Langford's car pulled into the driveway of their estate. The gates slid open without hesitation, and the vehicle moved smoothly down the long tree-lined path leading to their home. Everything about their arrival felt normal, calm, controlled, and yet everything had changed as the car came to a stop. Ellen stretched his arms while Zaven let out a long breath, the energy of the day finally settling into his bones. It had been a victory, but one that came with weight. The three of them stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city behind them for the first time in hours. They weren't being watched no more. Passengers, no more cameras, no more whispers, just them inside. The familiar scent of cedarwood and faint cologne filled the entryway. Their home was a mix of modern elegance and warmth, high ceilings, sleek lines, but still inviting. This wasn't just a place where business deals were made. It was where they lived. Darius loosened his tie slightly, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't a man who carried exhaustion visibly, but today had been a rare exception. Today hadn't just been about his sons, it had been about something much bigger. Elon and Zaven exchanged a glance before following him into the spacious living room. Zaven flopped onto the couch, so she's done right. Elon sat down, more slowly, setting his phone on the table. Yeah, he said quieter this time. I think she knows that too. Darius remained, standing, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city stretching beyond their home. The lights flickered, cars moved below, and the world continued on for everyone else. It was just another evening, but for Melora Cartwright, her world had just collapsed, and he had made sure she felt it. Zaven smirked. I kind of wish I could see her face right now. Darius exhaled slowly, and what would that change? Zaven blinked what Darius finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. What difference would it make if you saw her face, if you watched her regret it? Zaven hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. I mean, it'd just be satisfying, that's all. Darius let out a quiet, knowing chuckle, satisfying. He nodded almost to himself before taking a seat across from them. You think what happened today was about satisfaction? Ellen leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. It was about correction. Darius raised an eyebrow. Was it? Ellen didn't back down. She had power and she used it to make us feel like we didn't belong. You made sure she understood that she was the one who didn't belong. Darius studied his son for a long moment before responding. You're not wrong. Zaven crossed his arms. Then what's the problem? Darius sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The problem, he said, voice steady, is that if all you take from this is the satisfaction of seeing someone fall, then you haven't learned anything at all. Zaven frowned slightly. What else were we supposed to learn? Darius leaned forward. His gaze, steady power, isn't about revenge, Zaven. It's about responsibility. The room went silent. Darius continued, You're going to go through life, and people will judge you before they know you. They will assume things, underestimate you. Try to push you into corners where you have to prove yourself. His voice dropped slightly. You will be questioned in rooms where you should be leading. You will be looked at like an outsider in spaces where you belong. Zaven and AI and listened carefully now, and yes, Darius admitted, sometimes those people will get exactly what they deserve. Sometimes the world will see them fall. He glanced out the window again before turning back to them. But that's not what makes you powerful. What makes you powerful is the choice you make after you've won. Zaven sat back thinking, so what? We just forgive her. Darius gave a small, quiet smile. Number, you don't have to forgive her. He exhaled, but you don't have to carry her with you either. Elian absorbed that nodding. Slowly we moved forward. Darius nodded exactly. Zaven clicked his tongue, so no victory dance. Darius smirked. You can celebrate. Then his voice turned, just slightly sharper, but don't let your celebration turn into arrogance. Zaven rolled his eyes, but grinned. Fine, fine. Darius leaned back in his chair. Now tell me, what did you learn today? Elon spoke first that people like her never think they're wrong until they have no choice but to face it. Darius nodded. Good. Zavian leaned forward that we don't need to prove we belong. Darius smiled. Slightly better. Alliance sat up straighter, and that the best revenge is letting the truth do the work for you. Darius smiled fully now. Perfect. Zaven groaned. Gee, why do you always make things so philosophical? Darius laughed. Because the sooner you understand how the world works, the sooner you learn how to navigate it. Elon stood stretching his arms. I don't know about you, but I need food. Zaven hopped up after him. Oh yes, we deserve the best dinner ever for today's performance. Darius stood as well, shaking his head as his sons walked toward the kitchen. Arrogance, he muttered with amusement. Zavan turned around with a grin. No dad confidence. Darius smirked. Weck, see about that. The night stretched on the city, moving beyond their walls. The world continuing to turn to day had been about justice, about power, about a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. And as the Langford sat down for dinner, the world outside was still talking, but none of them had to say a word, because after today, the message had already been received. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. A black pilot, fresh off a long week of flights, was ready to return home and finally relax. But when he stepped onto the plane, not as a captain this time, but as a passenger. In first class, everything shifted. A flight attendant blocked his path, her polite smile hiding something colder underneath. Sir, I think you're in the wrong section. What happened next unraveled in ways no one expected. Just minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that left the entire cabin in stunned silence. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear before we dive in. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if this resonates with you, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. It all started with a boarding pass and a moment of doubt, but by the end of this flight, no one would look at the sky or each other the same way. Again, the terminal was alive, but the kind of life that bore a little resemblance to the world outside. It was a space caught between places. No roots, no permanence, just movement, announcements, and the steady thrum of impatience. Jordan Matthews stood among it all, the weight of his carry-on in one hand and his boarding pass in the other. He could feel the stares even when they weren't there, a sensation like a second skin woven over decades. Jordan was dressed in plain clothes, slacks pressed and shirt tucked in with the precision of a man accustomed to presenting himself in a world that demanded it. His pilot wings, heavy with 20 years of service, rested quietly in the small zippered compartment of his bag. He never wore them outside the cockpit. Not anymore. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, her voice clipped and bright through the speakers. Jordan moved toward the counter, not in a rush, but with the deliberate pace of someone who had nothing to prove. A least. Not outwardly. He handed over his ticket. The agent, a young woman with neat hair and tired eyes, took it with a smile that flickered for just a second, a pause. Too brief for most, but Jordan caught it. Her eyes scanned the ticket, and then him, as if reconciling two images that didn't belong together. First Class 2A. A lifetime of these small moments, and still they never failed to land somewhere deep in the chest. "Enjoy your flight," she said, returning his ticket with a flash of that same polite smile. But Jordan had already left, moving toward the jet bridge with the quiet, understanding that there would be more. There always was. The first class cabin was half empty, bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting. Jordan slipped into 2A, his window seat, and placed his bag overhead with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before he settled into the leather and glanced at the runway beyond the glass. He'd chosen this seat for the view. Old habits even as a passenger. The sky still called to him. The soft hum of boarding continued around him. A man in a gray suit and polished shoes passed by without a glance. His eyes fixed on the emails that glowed from his phone. A woman carefully balancing a designer purse and latte eased into 1C without so much as lifting her head. Jordan closed his eyes for the first time in days. There was silence and he let it wash over him, but silence like comfort was fleeting. "Excuse me, sir." His eyes opened to the sight of a flight attendant standing just inches from his seat, her uniform crisp. Name tag neatly pinned. Patricia, the smile she wore didn't quite fit, like a jacket borrowed from someone else. "This section is for first-class passengers," she said, lowering her voice as if to cushion the words. "I believe the main cabin is just beyond row 10. Jordan held her gaze for a moment, saying nothing before reaching calmly into his pocket. He unfolded the boarding pass and handed it to her. Her eyes flickered downward, scanning the slip of paper with careful precision, too. The pause this time lasted longer, the weight of it pressing into the space between them. She shifted, adjusting her footing as though the ground beneath her had shifted, too. "There must have been some mistake," she offered, though the evidence told another story. "No mistake," Jordan replied. Voice, "Even I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Passengers nearby glanced up, some subtle others. Not the man in 1D lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over the top. A woman AOW behind Jordan whispered something to her seatmate. Patricia hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the boarding pass before she handed it back. Of course, she said the words flat and brittle. Jordan took the slip of paper, folded it, and placed it back into his pocket. "Let me know if there's anything else," she added, but they both knew there wouldn't be. As she stepped away, Jordan turned his attention back to the window, the sky just beginning to blush with the last light of day, and somewhere in the soft hum of the cabin, he could feel it like the distant rumble of turbulence yet unseen. Jordan had spent his life above the clouds, but the ground always found ways to pull him back. The plane had begun to fill businessmen with weary eyes. Parents trying to corral restless children and retirees, exchanging quiet conversation as they navigated the narrow aisles. Each passenger carried their own weight, but none of them seemed to carry it quite the same way Jordan did. He glanced at the overhead bin where his uniform hat sat tucked beneath his bag, out of sight. Some things he'd learned were best left unseen. The hum of the engines whispered through the cabin as the final boarding calls echoed from the terminal. Jordan felt the shift in the air as the last few passengers shuffled in, the quiet settling over first class like dust on forgotten furniture. He was alone for now, but not for long. Patricia reappeared this time with another flight attendant trailing. Just behind her, Sandra, according to the polished silver name tag, older, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in the air and learned to bend without breaking. Jordan saw it in her eyes the moment they met him. "Sir, I'm Sandra, the senior attendant for this flight," she began, her voice warm but measured. "We just wanted to make sure everything was in order." It wasn't a question. Jordan felt the familiar prickle at the base of his neck, the kind it comes from knowing you are the only one being asked to explain your presence. "Everything seems fine to me," he replied, watching Patricia shift her weight beside Sandra. A pause stretched between them, like a wire pulled too tight. It's just that Sandra hesitated, her words carefully placed. Sometimes the system can make errors when issuing seat assignments. The system. Jordan almost smiled at the weightless way she said it, as if those words could neatly hold all the assumptions swirling beneath them. "Is that right?" he said, keeping his voice calm. Sandra nodded, offering a carefully curated smile. Jordan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "Then I suppose it's lucky that I'm exactly where I plan to be." Sandra's smile flickered. She hadn't expected resistance wrapped in courtesy. Jordan reached into the front pocket of his carry-on and pulled out his pilot's wings. The small metal insignia caught the cabin lights glinting. "Like a shard of glass. 20 years, he said, holding it up for just a moment before slipping it back inside. 10. EO0 flight hours, no errors in the system there." Patricia's gaze dropped to the floor, the color rising in her cheeks. Sandra, to her credit, held her ground. "Of course," she said, her tone softening. "I didn't mean to imply, but you did." Jordan interrupted gently but firmly. "And you're not the first." Sandra said nothing for a moment. The hum of the engines grew louder in the space between them. "I apologize," she said. Finally, Jordan nodded, accepting the words, even if they landed a little too late, as Sandra and Patricia retreated toward the galley. Jordan felt the shift around him. Passengers in first class who had been eavesdropping now lipped away, suddenly engrossed in their magazines or the idle scrolling of their phones. A man across the aisle, gray-haired and sunk deep into his leather seat, caught Jordan's eye and offered a tight smile. Jordan returned it, knowing exactly what it meant. "I see you." It wasn't pity, nor was it solidarity, just acknowledgement that the quiet exchange that black men recognized. Without speaking, Jordan closed his eyes. "Listen." Listening as the cabin door sealed shut. He had spent years watching the world from above, but no matter how high he flew, the ground had a way of reaching for him. It always did. The plane taxied slowly, as if even the ground beneath them sensed the weight in the air. Jordan could feel it pressing down, not from the altitude, but from the stillness, the kind it settled like dust when too many things were left unsaid. Sandra's apology had been polite, carefully sculpted, but it hung in the cabin. Like an unfinished sentence, he had heard apologies like that before, more for comfort than correction. Words designed to smooth the edges without truly reshaping the thing that caused the cut. He turned his head toward the window, watching the tarmac slip past, but he could feel the eyes behind him. They were there in the half-turn of heads, the flickers of curiosity, and the weight of those who tried a little too hard not to look. Jordan shifted his hands, resting lightly on the armrest, though every part of him remained coiled across the aisle. The gray-haired man from earlier leaned forward, catching Jordan's eye once more. This time the smile was gone, replaced by something quieter, understanding maybe, or something that wore the same face. Jordan offered a slight nod, the smallest gesture, and then looked away. The thing about silence was that it always filled the space, and in rooms like this, rooms that flew but never really left the ground, it took shape in the form of glances, half-whispered comments, and the steady hum of things left unchallenged. Jordan thought about the wings tucked away in his carry-on, about how different the room would feel if he had worn them openly, pinned proudly to his chest as he walked to his seat. Would Patricia have stopped him? Then would Sandra have asked twice about the system's error? Would the man 2 rows ahead, the one glancing back now and again with quick, guilty looks, have bothered to whisper at all? But Jordan had left his wings in the bag, and that was the truth of the thing. The plane lifted and the earth fell away beneath them for a moment. Jordan let the sky take him as it always had. The engines hummed low, vibrating gently beneath his seat, and for a fleeting breath it felt like the world below couldn't reach him here. But then the curtain shifted. Patricia moved through the divide between first class and the main cabin, her expression carefully neutral. She held a tray of drinks, her hands steady now, though her shoulders betrayed the tension she was trying to hide. Jordan watched as she approached, noting how her steps slowed the closer she came. "Can I offer you something to drink, sir?" He caught the hesitation in her voice, the unspoken weight behind the word, "Sir, water, no ice." He didn't say it aloud. Instead, he simply nodded, watching as she poured the glass and placed gently on the tray in front of him. Patricia lingered for half a second longer than necessary. Jordan could see the words she wanted to say dancing just behind her lips, but she swallowed them down, and then she was gone, disappearing back behind the curtain as if the interaction had never happened. But the moment stuck. Jordan sipped the water, letting the coolness sit on his tongue longer than needed. It was a small thing, really, a drink, a glance, a passing moment, but the small things had a way of stacking up, and Jordan had learned long ago that these were the moments that shaped a life. Not the storms, not the sharp winds, but the slow, persistent drip of doubt. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, Jordan could feel it not in the air around him, but in the space within him, where years of small things had gathered and grown heavy, and the sky vast and empty, as it was suddenly felt smaller. There was a rhythm to flight, one Jordan knew well, the quiet hum at cruising altitude, the soft clatter of trays being cleared, the gentle descent that carried everyone toward a place they called home. But some descents were longer than others. Jordan's seat felt smaller now. Though nothing around him had changed, the leather pressed against his shoulders, and the soft chatter from first class seemed louder than before. Sandra reappeared, moving with the effortless grace of someone who had spent her life in the air. She passed by Jordan without a glance, pausing. Instead, at the seat directly behind him. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Kensington?" she asked softly. Jordan didn't need to turn around to know which passenger. It was Kensington, the man who only minutes ago had made a point to request Patricia double-check the situation in the main cabin. "No, I'm fine," Kensington replied. His voice was casual now, as if his earlier suspicions had been nothing more than idle thoughts. Jordan listened as Sandra lingered for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for Kensington to acknowledge what had passed between them. But silence once again held the space. Jordan traced the rim of his water glass, with his finger feeling the slow, deliberate pull of frustration curling somewhere deep beneath his ribs. It was always the quiet ones, the men like Kensington who never raised their voices, but let their doubts settle in the cracks of polite conversation, the ones who smiled just enough to be disarming, who prefaced their prejudice with phrases like, "I'm sure it's nothing, but Jordan could handle," the loud ones, the ones who made their distaste known without shame. At least with them, there was no pretense, no dance around what was already plain to see, but Kensington had whispered, and whispers traveled farther than shouts. Sandra returned her gaze, finally meeting Jordan's as she approached. She hesitated, the weight of In's spoken words tugging at her features. Captain Matthews, she began, keeping her voice low. I just wanted to. Jordan stopped her with a slight raise of his hand. Don't, he said gently, though his voice carried the unmistakable weight of someone too tired to collect apologies. I know how this goes. Sandra's eyes softened still. She added after a pause. I want you to know. I see it. I saw it then, and I see it now. Jordan met her gaze, and for a brief moment there was no cabin between them. No title, no uniform, just two people caught in the quiet understanding of what the world often tried to ignore. Thank you, he said, meaning it. Sandra nodded and stepped back toward the galley, leaving Jordan to the company of his thoughts. The descent began, the plane tilted slightly, and the faint tug of gravity signaled the slow return to Earth. Jordan watched the clouds thin beneath them, giving way to the city lights scattered far below. He wondered how many times Kensington had trusted someone like him to land a plane without ever knowing it. How many flights had ended with polite applause, never realizing the hands guiding them through storms looked nothing like what they'd imagined. Jordan let the thought linger as the plane sank lower. The runway lights coming into view, bright against the night. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life mastering the art of flying, but the hardest part was always the landing. The plane drifted lower, and with it came the inevitable return to the world below. A world Jordan Matthews knew all too well. It wasn't the flight that tired him, it never was, no. The exhaustion lived in the space between moments. And the slow descent back into a country that seemed to forget him. As soon as his uniform came off, the cabin grew quieter as the flight attendants began their final checks. Patricia avoided his row, though so Jordan could feel her presence linger like a shadow just beyond his vision. The other passengers, those who had watched the earlier exchange with quiet interest that now shifted uncomfortably as if trying to distance themselves from the weight of what they had witnessed, but that weight had already settled and no polite indifference could lift it. Jordan glanced toward the front of the cabin where Kensington sat, his hands folded neatly over his lap. The man had said nothing since his request for Patricia to make sure everything was in order. The accusation had been subtle, wrapped in silk, but the cut it left was unmistakable. Jordan knew that kind of cut, the kind that didn't bleed immediately but lingered under the skin long after the moment had passed. He thought of his father, a man who had worked the railroads before they let him near the trains his father had worn, patience like armor, teaching Jordan that survival often meant smiling through clenched teeth. Don't give them a reason to doubt you, son, he said once, adjusting the brim of his hat as he prepared for another day beneath the unforgiving southern sun. They already doubt enough. Jordan hadn't understood then, not fully, but years later, sitting beneath the gaze of men like Kensington, he understood it was never just about doubt. It was about who had the right to erase it, Dot and who had to prove they belonged in the room. The seatbelt sign chimed. Jordan straightened in his seat, his hands resting lightly on his knees a few rows ahead. Patricia's voice filtered through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbacks are upright and tray tables are secured. Her voice carried the same calm professionalism it always did, but Jordan wondered if she felt the shift beneath the surface due. The subtle ripple that now coursed through the first-class cabin. The thing about racism Jordan had learned was that it didn't need to raise its voice. It rarely shouted, it whispered, and in those whispers it thrived the businessman, who didn't say his name but referred to him as Sir just a little too forcefully, the flight attendant who double-checked his ticket not out of policy but out of instinct, the passenger who, despite hearing the pilot's announcement, still leaned over to ask Sandra if everything was really fine back there. Jordan had lived in those whispers his entire life, and yet he hadn't grown numb to them as the wheels touched the runway. Jordan exhaled the return to solid ground. Always brought clarity, but rarely comfort. Outside the tarmac stretched wide beneath the soft glow of airport lights. Inside the cabin stirred to life as passengers reached for phones, bags, and the safety of routine. Jordan stayed seated. A part of him wondered if Kensington would look his way, if the man's eyes might finally meet him and acknowledge what had happened. But Kensington remained fixed on his phone, scrolling through emails that would never touch the edges of this moment. Jordan smiled faintly to himself, not out of bitterness, but out of something deeper. Understanding men like Kensington didn't carry these moments with them, but Jordan did, and that was the difference. As the plane rolled to the gate, Jordan reached for his carry-on. His pilot's wing sat nestled in the side pocket, and for a brief second he traced the outline with his fingers, a reminder that no matter how often the world doubted him, the sky never did. There was always a line, though few ever saw it. Jordan Matthews saw it every time he crossed an airport terminal. It was not drawn in ink or cordoned off with velvet ropes. No. This line lived in the space between the security checkpoint and the boarding gate, between the expectation and the assumption. It whispered through the polished hallways of American life. Silent but omnipresent, and Jordan had learned to walk it carefully. But that day the line shifted beneath his feet, as it often did when he was least prepared for it. Disembarking had been uneventful, but Annis clung to him. Jordan felt the stares, passengers stealing glances, as if piecing together the image of a black pilot with the dissonance of the earlier confrontation. Patricia had mumbled another apology as he passed. The words were quick, reflexive, but Jordan caught the flicker of shame in her eyes. She hadn't meant harm, but meaning rarely mattered to the people on the receiving end of assumptions in the terminal. Jordan kept his head high, resisting the impulse to shrink into the crowd, but there was always someone a security guard near baggage claim gave him a once overdue. The kind that lingered a beat too long. Jordan kept walking. A middle-aged man in a pressed Navy suit paused at the sight of him. The man's eyes flicked down to the wings now clipped to Jordan's shirt, as if their presence disturbed the natural order of things. Jordan offered a polite nod. The man did not return it. The line had shifted again. It happened next at the car rental counter. Jordan stepped forward, handing his license to the clerk. She was young, maybe in her early 20s. Her smile bright but guarded, her eyes moved between his ID and his face, as if reconciling the two returning from a business trip. She asked the question casual to be harmless. Jordan paused, measuring his response. "I'm a pilot," he replied simply, the weight of the words landing as softly. As he could manage, the clerk's eyes flickered for a second. Jordan thought she might challenge it. "Oh," she said instead, handing him the keys. "Safe travels." This was how the line worked. No all right, denial, no blatant rejection, only the gentle probing of existence, as if his mere presence demanded explanation. Jordan had walked this line his entire life. And the thing about walking a line, does that make you tired by the time Jordan stepped into the airport? Cafe. His patience was running low. He found a seat by the window where the hum of engines filled the space between sips of lukewarm coffee. Outside planes taxied along the runways, oblivious to the small dramas unfolding inside. It was there, staring at the tarmac, that the day caught up with him, the weight of Kensington's condescension. Patricia's nervous apology, the clerk's subtle hesitation. Small things. Yes, but small things accumulate like stones in the pockets of a man. Treading water. Jordan thought of his father again, and the stories he never told his father had lived under the same line, though perhaps it had been drawn with thicker ink in those days. Jordan wondered how often the man had swallowed his pride to make life easier for those around him. Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by a faint voice beside him. "Excuse me, Captain." He turned to find a young black boy, no more than 10, standing awkwardly by his table. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity, his hands tucked into the pockets of an oversized hoodie. "My dad says you're a pilot," the boy said, glancing nervously toward a nearby table where his father sat watching with quiet pride. Jordan smiled, the weight in his chest lifting. "If only slightly." "I am," Jordan replied, offering his hand. The boy shook it carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. "I didn't know. Pilots could." The boy hesitated, searching for the right words. Jordan understood. "You can be anything," he said gently before the boy could finish. "Don't let anyone tell you differently." The boy's eyes lit up. His father, still seated at the other table, offered a knowing nod. Jordan returned it as the boy walked back to his father. Jordan watched them go. The line momentarily dissolving beneath their shared glance, it would return as it always did. But for now, the sky felt just a little closer. The table was always there, just out of reach. Jordan. Matthews had been circling it for most of his life. It wasn't a physical table. No mahogany edges to press his elbows against, no polished silverware to reflect his face, but it was their duet and spoken gathering of power of influence, and more often than not, the seat meant for him was missing. The next morning, Jordan arrived at the conference center early. It was a leadership summit, the kind of event where people in tailored suits shook hands with a little too much enthusiasm. Jordan adjusted his tie, acutely aware of how he filled the space. There weren't many men who looked like him in the room, there never were. The first panel began with little fanfare, for executives lined the stage, discussing innovation growth, and leadership words like vision and synergy floated through the air, meaning everything and nothing at once. Jordan sat near the back, his hands folded over a notebook he hadn't yet opened. He listened, but his mind wandered. The faces on stage, polished and pale, spoke of progress, but their vision seemed confined to the narrow lanes they'd long traveled. Jordan had flown across continents, but still felt like he hadn't gone anywhere. He recognized this room even if he'd never stepped foot in it before. The same conversations, the same panels, the same doors half opened, but rarely inviting him through. It wasn't until lunch that the day began to shift. Jordan found himself at a round table near the center of the dining hall. A few other attendees joined him. Two men in their late 50s and a woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The conversation drifted toward business mergers, acquisitions, the usual currents that carried men like them toward success. Jordan stayed quiet, waiting halfway through the meal. The man seated across from him leaned in. "So, Jordan," he began, his tone light but probing. "What brings you here? I didn't catch your title earlier." Jordan smiled politely. "Captain Jordan Matthews. I'm a pilot." A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face, quick but not quick enough to hide. "Ah," the man said. "Recovering aviation, fascinating. I guess leadership takes many forms there." Jordan could see the calculation behind the man's eyes, the subtle downgrading of his presence at the table. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't even conscious, but it was there. Just beneath the surface. Jordan had faced this particular storm before leadership. Jordan replied calmly, "Has to take many forms. The people in my cockpit expect nothing less." The woman beside him glanced up, interest flickering across her face. "Captain Matthews," she said, setting down her fork. "How long have you been flying?" 20 years. Jordan answered. 10. Zero flight hours. There was a pause, a shifting of weight at the table. Something changed in the air. Jordan saw it happened. Do the recalibration, the room hadn't expected him to carry that kind of experience. The woman smiled knowingly, as if she'd been waiting for the rest of the table to catch up. "And how many passengers do you carry on an average flight?" she asked, her voice light, but leading 200. Jordan replied, folding his hands again. "Give or take." The man across from him chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's a lot of responsibility." He admitted it is. Jordan said simply, "Which is why I'm sitting at this table for a brief moment." Silence stretched between them, but this wasn't the awkward silence Jordan had grown accustomed to. It was the kind of silence that precedes recognition later. As the summit wound down, Jordan lingered by the exit, shaking hands with a few of the attendees. The woman from lunch approached, holding a small business card between her fingers. "I'd like to keep in touch," she said. "Your perspective is valuable." Jordan accepted the card with a nod. "Thank you," he replied. She smiled. "Next time," she added, "don't wait for them to ask. Just take the seat. Jordan watched her walk away, the card cool in his palm. Some tables don't offer you a seat, but sometimes you pull one up anyway. There is a point during every flight when the sky shifts from endless blue to something denser, heavier. The plane dips, and gravity pulls a little harder. Jordan Matthews knew this moment well. It was the descent. The part that brought you back down to where everything you left behind still waited. No matter how high you climbed, you always returned to the ground. His phone buzzed on the cab's armrest as he left the summit, a text from his daughter. How was the conference? He thought about how to answer. The summit had ended, the way these things often do, with polite handshakes and vague promises of collaboration. Jordan had taken the woman's advice. By the afternoon, he wasn't waiting for invitations to speak. He leaned in, yet for every nod of respect, he still noticed the sideways glances, the fleeting moments of hesitation, the quiet suggestion that his seat was borrowed. Not permanent. It wasn't hostility. It was habit good. He finally replied productive. But that wasn't the whole truth. Jordan wasn't sure the truth could be neatly folded into a message. Later that evening, Jordan stood in his kitchen, washing the remnants of dinner from his plate. His daughter Maya sat at the table, flipping through a textbook. Law school had sharpened her. She asked harder questions. Now he could feel one coming. "Have you ever thought about quitting?" she asked. Not looking up, Jordan's hands stilled under the water. "Why would you ask that?" Maya shrugged. "I don't know. I hear your stories sometimes, and I wonder why you keep pushing through it all." Jordan dried his hands slowly because he said carefully, "If I don't, someone else will have to." Maya finally lifted her gaze. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "Why does it always have to be you?" Jordan didn't answer right away. He thought about the weight of it, the long, exhausting weight that people like him carried, the kind that pressed down without ever letting up. "It doesn't," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I get to stop the following week." Jordan returned to work. He walked through the airport back in uniform, and like clockwork, the same people who had once questioned his presence in first class now opened doors without hesitation. The irony was sharp, but not surprising. Uniforms, after all, have a way of bending perception. Before takeoff, Jordan sat alone in the cockpit, performing the pre-flight checks. His co-pilot arrived, a young man with nervous energy and bright ambition. "I read about you," the co-pilot blurted out as he settled into his seat. "You're one of the few black captains in the fleet, right?" Jordan kept his eyes on the instrument panel. "Is that what you read?" "Well," the younger pilot hesitated, realizing the weight of his words. "I just mean it's impressive you've made it pretty far." Jordan adjusted a dial, his tone steady. "Farther than some, not as far as others." The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, but Jordan didn't let him anger there. "You'll learn," Jordan said, easing the tension. "It's not about making it far. It's about making sure someone else can follow." The young man nodded, absorbing the lesson. By the time the plane lifted off, the sky stretched endlessly ahead, but Jordan didn't focus on the horizon. He thought about the descent, the part where everything below came back into view. He thought about Maya, about the tables he'd sat at, and the ones he'd yet to reach. The sky, no matter how far you climbed, was never permanent. But each time you returned to the ground, you brought a little more of it with you.